Pleasure to have you this morning with us. We're here at the Steinert Museum of Natural History. And you can see it's a full auditorium, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening, I believe it is that time there, and I apologize for not being there in person, but I am grateful that so many people have come from so many different sectors to take on this huge challenge that we're facing. I can see the room on video, and it actually looks familiar. I think I was part of a meeting there just a few months ago. So it does feel like I am there. I'm going to give a quick overview of the EAT-Lancet report. This is the work of about 35 people who worked on this project from many different sectors, including nutrition, agriculture, earth sciences, social sciences, and many other disciplines. The challenge was huge and complex, so it really did take the input and the perspectives of many different people coming from, in fact, 17 different countries, working for 3 years to put this together. And what we did take was primarily a global overview, and so it's really critical that this kind of analysis be taken down to a country level, just as you're doing, because actually that's where the action, most of the action will have to take place. So again, I'm extremely grateful that so many people have come, including leaders from many different sectors. The challenge we were given in the EAT-Lancet Commission was how to feed about 9.8 billion people who will inhabit the world by 2050, a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. The standard response until very recently has been, by people in the food and agriculture area, has been that we need to increase food production, mostly grains, by 70%. Much of it is to feed animals that people will want to consume. And that has been what we've called the business as usual model. As it turns out, that will not be optimally healthy nor sustainable. On the nutrition and health side, we have many challenges. Still today, about 2 billion people lack key micronutrients like iron and vitamin A. About 155 million are stunted. 2 billion adults are overweight or obese, and that number is increasing rapidly. And diet quality is far from optimal in all countries. We did, as part of our analysis, look at diet quality in different countries around the world. We used a measure of diet quality that goes from a scale of 0 to 100. And this is what we found. Diet quality varies a lot around the world. The Mediterranean area tends to have better diet quality than most places. And in fact, Israel has among the best quality diets, along with Turkey and Southeast Asia and Japan. But still, even the highest quality country, Israel included, had a score of about 65 out of 100. So in all countries, there's much room for improvement and much more potential for better health. On the climate and environmental side, the challenge is equally or even greater perhaps. We happen to have a president who thinks that climate change is a hoax. I don't think I have to convince anyone there. And we don't need complicated statistical models to show that. We just have to have anyone just has to be a bit aware of what's happening around the world. For example, the Arctic Ocean is opening up over summers in the recent years, which did not happen before in human history. Glaciers are retreating all around the world, which integrates climate change, temperature change over periods of years, not just over a period of decades and centuries, not just a few years. Kilimanjaro, where I spent part of my career working in Tanzania, always had a healthy ice cap and glaciers on top. Now it's just a wisp, and that's going to be mostly gone in about 10 years, we're told. And most ominously, the Greenland ice cap is melting at an accelerating rate. And it really is this acceleration that is most disturbing. As you can see, going back to the 1800s and up to almost the mid-1900s, these are monthly temperatures around the world, the global temperatures, and there was some bouncing around, but really not much trend here. And then about 1960, we started to see an acceleration. And even in the last decade, these are monthly temperatures we've had record temperatures almost year after year. So there's been a clear acceleration in global temperatures, and that is what's really worrisome and frightening, in fact, that we're entering some vicious circles here, whereby as global temperature increases, that increases melting of the permafrost, the Arctic ice cap shrinks, among other changes, air conditioning increases, and all of these changes increase the release of methane and carbon dioxide, important greenhouse gases, which speeds up temperature increases, and we go round and around in an accelerating rate, or some people have called this tipping points that can be irreversible. So how do we tackle this? Clearly a daunting challenge, and we have to start somewhere. So we broke this problem down into 4 steps. Again, the problem is how to find a pathway to a healthy, sustainable diet, and we used 2050 as the one time post. So our first step was to define a healthy reference diet. It's easy to say everyone should eat a healthy diet, but what does this really mean quantitatively? So we used the best available evidence from all sources, including controlled feeding studies, long-term cohort studies, and in a few instances, there were available randomized trials. Then we defined planetary boundaries. Unfortunately, our colleagues in the earth sciences have been working on this problem for a number of years, and we really tried to quantify how much greenhouse gas, for example, could we produce and still have a sustainable planet. And we looked at also, besides greenhouse gas, cropland use, water use, nitrogen and phosphorus application, and extinction rates. Obviously, we can't continue to consume more and more, produce more and more of these products and have a sustainable environment. There has to be some limit. Then we used a global food systems model to see if the healthy diet we defined could fit within the planetary boundaries. And then we outlined strategies to achieve the goals. Just for an example here, we looked at major protein sources in quite a bit of detail because the particular choices that we make have important impacts on both health and environment. So just for example here, this is looking at randomized trials comparing red meat with other sources of animal protein and looking at the effects of LDL cholesterol. And this is a meta-analysis summarizing the literature. If we compare red meat to usual diet, it didn't seem to have much effect, but the problem is in this kind of analysis, usual diet in most places is not a very healthy diet, usually made of a lot of refined starch, sugar, and until recently, a lot of trans fat. Or if we looked at red meat compared to other animal protein sources, there was not too much of a difference. But if we compared red meat to high quality protein or plant sources of protein, such as legumes, soy, and nuts, then there was a clear increase in LDL cholesterol. Since LDL cholesterol is a potent risk factor for coronary heart disease, this would tend to make us think, all else being equal, that we're replacing red meat with these high quality plant protein sources would have beneficial effects. And we also then took the next step of looking in large epidemiologic studies that had compared red meat or replacing red meat with other protein sources, looking at various health outcomes. And we looked at total mortality, diabetes, stroke, and coronary heart disease. And we could see that replacing red meat with pretty much any other protein source predicted lower risks of these major health outcomes. For example, replacing red meat with dairy, nuts, fish, and poultry all were related to lower risk of these major health outcomes. But particularly the plant protein sources, as predicted by the effects on LDL, were particularly potent in terms of being associated with lower risk of coronary heart disease. So we went through a lot of literature looking at both the controlled feeding studies in the short term and then long-term epidemiologic studies. And where we do see that replacing red meat with healthy plant-based protein sources results in better health outcomes, then the question is, how much red meat could we allow in the diet to be optimally healthy? And there, again, we looked at large epidemiologic studies. This happens to be the combined data from our 3 large cohorts of over 200,000 men and women. About 14,000 during several decades of follow-up developed type 2 diabetes. And there was a quite clear linear dose-response relationship. But even going a small increase, about 1 ounce, about 28 grams per day, was significantly associated with higher risk of type 2 diabetes. Not a large increase, but statistically significant. So we took as a target the midpoint, or about 14 grams a day is a target number for red meat consumption. But for all our targets, we set a range too. Clearly one could be vegan, one didn't have to eat red meat or other animal products to be healthy, and one could. 14 is not a precise number. Maybe that number is 25, 20 or 25 or 10. There's some flexibility about this, in part because humans are adaptable and we don't have exact statistical precision. So we went through all the major components, all the major food groups, and I won't go into the numbers. This is just a quick overview, but the end result was a plate that looks more or less like this. Mostly fruits and vegetables by volume, whole grains, most of the protein sources, not all, coming from plant sources, healthy fats, and very modest amounts of sugar. As a reality check, we compared this to the traditional Mediterranean diet. The best data are from Greece in the 1960s. And at that time, men were consuming 35 grams of protein a day from red meat plus poultry. Actually, the number that we would get using our target numbers came out to be 43 grams a day, so very much in the same range as Greek men, who at that time had the healthiest life expectancy in the world in the analyses that had been done. We then took the next step of looking at how much disease, how much mortality might we prevent if the whole world adopted the dietary targets. And we used 3 different models. They all came to very similar results, about 20 to 25% reduction in total mortality among adults, which obviously is a huge potential benefit. We then looked at gaps around the world by region between the dietary targets, which are represented by this vertical red line here, and what these regions are actually consuming a day. So in general, much more red meat than the dietary targets, although sub-Saharan Africa has actually less consumption of red meat than the dietary targets, and a few other places such as Southeast Asia also have quite low consumption of red meat. So it's not that all countries need to reduce their red meat consumption, but most do. Starchy vegetables were excessive in most places, but importantly, many food groups, fish, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts, were actually well below our dietary targets. So some of the potential for improvement in health, and a large part actually of the potential for improved health, comes from increasing these healthy sources of minerals, vitamins, and proteins. We then looked at the literature on greenhouse gas production and other environmental impacts from various food groups. Probably you are already well familiar that far and away red meat has the biggest greenhouse gas impact. Pork, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs have much less, but still plant sources of protein have far much less consumption, far much less impact on greenhouse gas production compared to even some of these other intermediate animal protein sources. For example, legumes, nuts are very low even compared to these other sources of protein. We then looked at, again, the question of how could we make these dietary targets fit within the planetary boundaries, just using greenhouse gas production here as an example of what we looked at. The boundary was set at 5.0 by the United Nations Climate Change Panel. In 2010, we were already just a little bit over that boundary. And if we followed the business as usual model, we were on track to about double the planetary boundary by 2050. But just by adopting these planetary targets, we could bring that number back down to stay just at the planetary boundary. And if we made some improvements in production and reduction of food waste, we could further decrease the greenhouse gas impact somewhat. But by far the biggest thing was by changing our diets. So to conclude the major part of the EAT-Lancet report, we are on a path leading to ecological disasters and a sick and unstable global population. But on the other hand, feeding 10 billion people a healthy and sustainable diet is possible. This would improve the well-being of billions of people and allow us to pass on to our children and grandchildren a viable planet. So there is a potential double win. I just want to note that, of course, making changes in our food system and in our diets is critically important, but there are many other changes we need to make if we're going to stay on track or get on track or way off track the IPCC pathway to avoiding disaster by climate change. All our calculations assume we're virtually at 100% green energy by 2050. That's massively important. We can't get there without that. We also have to protect our environment, minimize short-term pollutants like methane and carbon dioxide. We need to use economic levers and also pay attention to population. We can't continue to increase our population at the rate we are. We have to get to really an average of 2 children per family as quickly as possible. You know, we are in some places, but some places are not close to that yet. So how do we get there? We did spend quite a bit of time on strategies, just very briefly and very broadly. We need to seek international commitments toward shifting toward healthy diets, reorienting agricultural priorities from producing high quantities of food to producing healthy foods. We need to sustainably intensify food production to increase high quality output. We can't continue to cut down forests and plow up prairie land. We have to produce more food in an environmentally sensitive way on the land that we already have. This will take strong and coordinated governance of land and oceans, and we need to cut in half food losses and waste in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And all of our targets, our goals are very closely interwoven with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So just very briefly, I did want to make the point that those are high-level aspirational goals, but everybody, whether you're involved directly in this area or not, can be part of the solution. In fact, must be part of the solution. We need to take actions in various sectors, in schools and childcare, in our healthcare systems, work sites, food environment, our built environment, in the mass media, and we need to involve economic levers as well. And this can happen all the way from individuals, your personal decisions and choices at the family level. For example, I've just put some X's here. This could be one person with acting in all of these areas. They might have a family policy that we don't, we have red meat, for example, not more than once a week, and instead emphasize healthy plant sources of protein. And also including modest consumption of dairy and poultry. At the community level, a healthcare worker might work to improve the food system, the foods that are available at their health center and educational programs at their health center. This person might work in a hospital, for example, and work to promote healthier, sustainable diets in our hospital systems. And I can say in our country, we're very far from that in most of our hospitals. That person might, at the state level, be writing editorials, commentaries, or forming groups to promote healthy and sustainable diets, or they might be someone who also has access to committees or involved in committees at a national level. The point is that everybody needs to be involved, and no matter where you are, you can make a difference. So just to conclude, the secret weapon we have is actually healthy, sustainable diets that can be a double win, both for health and for individual health and for planetary health, and be enjoyable and aspirational all at the same time. So thank you again for coming together, and I look forward to hearing the results of your deliberations. Thank you.